Do Catholics worship Mary? Well, it seems like Catholic apologists have been trying to convince Protestants that no, we do not worship Mary. And everything seemed to be going along pretty well until Trent Horn from Catholic Answers said,
It's sort of like the claim Catholics worship Mary. That claim is true.
Now, Trent also said some stuff after that, but of course it doesn't really matter. The only thing that does are those three key words: Catholics worship Mary. End of discussion, right? Now, I would say that in this video, Trent made a huge mistake. He tried to make a fine-grained theological distinction in a video that any Protestant might watch ever. Now, in that video, Trent was not discussing the worship of Mary. Rather, he was talking about whether or not Muslims actually worship the Creator, the true God. Now, that is something of an intramural discussion, and one's answer really relies on some very fine-tuned theological points, and Trent was trying to give an analogy about how the way we use our words, specifically the word worship, can change what we mean by the sentence, do Muslims worship the same God as Christians? So Trent offered up the analogy of how careful we have to be with the word worship when discussing Mary. So the problem that I think this caused is that Trent was using this analogy with an audience that he expected to understand the theological distinctions he was making. But of course, people who do not are going to watch the video, and all they're going to hear is Catholics worship Mary. So let's unpack this a bit and get into the theological distinctions that are not only important from a Catholic point of view, but are actually biblical. One of the difficulties that Catholics face is that we are not in a church that only got started 10 or 20 years ago. The language of our theology goes back thousands of years, and the church doesn't work very hard at trying to keep it updated with the nuances and changes in the evolving living languages into which its theology is translated. And so right now we're faced with a difficulty because there are nuanced words in Greek that don't necessarily have a very good modern translation into English. The word worship, for example, comes from an Old English term, worthship. And while worthship may be difficult to pronounce and somewhat strange sounding, it pretty much means what you think it would. Worth means something having value, and ship refers to a state of affairs. So for example, if you have a friend, you are in a state of friendship with that friend. So there is a sense in which to worship something is simply to act according to its value. The British would use the word worship as just a title of honor. They would call a king or a dignitary your worship. Now, of course, we don't use that word in such a wide spectrum generic use today. Worship, the modern form of the word, is generally only used when applied to God, the supreme thing of value in existence. And that's where the trouble comes in, because when we are doing theology, we are often making very fine distinctions between things, and if there isn't a very obvious and universally agreed upon term to reflect that theology, we can get ourselves misunderstood. So for example, in the Greek, you have the word Latreia. Latreia is used for the kind of worship or value that is due to God alone. This is why attributing God's value to a statue or some lower being is called idolatry, idol Latreia. Typically today, the English word worship only refers to Latreia, and so for Trent to say, well, Catholics worship Mary, sounds exactly like what we are being accused of, which is treating Mary as if she is on the same level as God, which Catholics do not. Rather, Mary is offered what Catholics refer to as Doulia. Doulia also comes from the Greek word. You might have heard doulos, or slave or servant. It's basically giving someone the honor and doing for them what should be done for them because it is their due. That's how I remember it. So we can give God his due, but we can also give a king his due, or the mailman his due. If we're giving anything its due, we're sort of doing Doulia. Now, in modern English, we don't typically translate Doulia as worship because it would sound confusing. It's kind of like another Greek word, proskinesis. That word refers to a bowing down before, and it can be done in worship in the Latreia sense, but it can also be done in worship in the Doulia sense. We see this in Scripture. In Matthew 18:26, a servant bows before his master. And some translations say the servant fell on his knees and worshipped him. In Revelation 3:9, we have enemies bowing down before believers, but it's the same word that was translated worship. Jacob bows before Esau. Nathan the prophet bows before King David. And importantly, the wise men bow before Jesus. And what that means is that this word can refer to any kind of bowing or reverencing in Scripture. You only know from the context whether it's Latreia-like worship or doulos-like worship. Now, when it comes to Mary, what does the church actually teach? Well, we do not offer Mary Latreia worship. That is due to God alone, and Catholic teaching is very clear on this point. So if worship is only understood as translating Latreia, then it is not true that Catholics worship Mary. Rather, Mary is given Doulia, or what the church calls Hyper-Dulia. And that's because of the things that are due this kind of reverence, or whatever you want to call it, Mary is the highest, because she is the mother of God. So she gets the most Doulia, Hyper-Dulia. But that is still a different category than Latreia. So, for example, the Catechism teaches that saints could be said to receive worship in the Doulia sense. Mary can be said to receive worship in the Hyper-Dulia sense, but only God receives worship in the highest Latreia sense. So what Trent said was true, but only true in a very certain way, a way that he went on to explain in the video, but which most Protestants are probably going to either ignore or twist, because they just love thinking that Catholics are idolaters and that we're out there worshiping Mary and the saints, when we are not, except when we are, but only in the Doulia or Hyper-Dulia sense. Sorry, theology's hard. All right, I hope this video has been informative to you and enjoyable. If it was, why don't you give it a like and subscribe to Doug Beaumont if you are into philosophy, apologetics, and Christian theology. Until next time, God bless.